Well, I'm going to talk about fire effects and teasing apart fire frequency, intensity, sunlight, and season, if I can. Try to anyway.
Go
Hearing me
ahead.
any better?
They got the volume going up, Craig. So I think this might be as good as we got it. So talk at the top of your voice, and I think we have you. So go ahead.
All right. Well, as I mentioned, I'm very happy to be with y'all. I wish I could see you in person. There's several people there I'd love to catch up with and meet some new friends. I really enjoyed the previous presentation. Seems like Haley and Eric are doing a lot of really good work on the area that they're working on, and I look forward to seeing results from that. Of course, we've had a Bob White study here in Tennessee for several years, and I've done a lot of work with that, so have a vested interest in hearing how that goes. All that said, Kip mentioned that I was with y'all several years ago and talked about fire frequency and fire timing. And Mark Turner was with you last year and talked about another project that we had looking at the effects of fire timing. And when Kip asked me this time, I thought I would try to bring some past research studies together with ones that we have going on now and share with you the latest information we have and share with you some results that have not been published yet, but just give you an update on where we are. This has been very interesting and fun for me. I think informative for both private and public lands managers who are using fire to try and reach their objectives. Now, this is not forwarding, Kip. Wow. There it goes. I think we all know what prescribed fire is, but I put this definition up here so you could see the last part of the definition that I think is very important. I mean, it's all important, but here's what I'm going to try to concentrate on, where it says to accomplish predetermined, well-defined management objectives. You know, it's a hard stretch to say that fire is a precise management tool. It's something more like blunt force trauma, if you will. But I'm very interested in seeing what we can find out about fire to make it as precise as we can to meet very specific management objectives for different species and as their needs change through the years. And so that's what this is really about, trying to uh, predict and to implement our fire strategy as specific and precise as we can to meet objectives. There are three factors that generally are regarded as the primary factors that influence or drive fire effects, and that would be intensity, frequency, and timing. However, I'm going to add a fourth one. And fire practitioners often argue a little bit about which one is most important or most influential. Usually they discuss intensity and frequency. But I think what you'll see is all of these are so closely tied together, you can hardly talk about one without considering the other. And that's what I'm trying to bring together here. Of course, as you see from the picture, this is a picture of a high intensity fire set purposefully. This was by the Forest Service down on the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, where they were trying to restore pitch pine and were successful at doing so. But high intensity fire, of course, can change a forest type, kill trees, set back the successional stage, and direct effects on wildlife are more likely than with low intensity fire. Low intensity fire, of course, may consume fine fuels only and be a little more patchy in distribution and might not even set back the successional stage, but instead maintain the existing successional stage. Of course, woody stems are at least top killed when temperatures reach 140 to 145 degrees for about a minute. That's an important thing to keep in mind. And then as we go to the next factor, I'll talk about the frequency. So, which do you think is most impactful or most important? I don't think you can really separate them. I have separated frequency into two groups here. I think it's very important, and I hope to bring out why as I go through here. Frequent fire, I'm calling every 1 to 2 years, and when you're using frequent fire, you can maintain an early successional stage or early seral stage if you are already working with an early seral stage. Of course, it reduces woody composition, and may reduce soft mast, especially if you're using an annual fire return interval. With infrequent fire, I broke this into two separate groups because there is a difference. In most situations and most sites in the eastern U.S., if you're burning every 3 to 5 years, you're going to have a lot of woody encroachment. But you're able to keep that knockback back and maintain some herbaceous component. However, and this is looking at several data sets throughout the eastern U.S., once you let that go to a 6 year interval or longer, you have essentially lost the herbaceous understory underneath because of the shade effect of the sprouting and succeeding trees. Now, if you burn hot enough to top kill those trees, of course you have a good flush of herbaceous species for 2 to 3 years following, but the resprouting trees will quickly overtake the herbaceous cover, and within about 6 years you've largely lost it. So there is a distinction there in your infrequent fire, looking at 3 to 5 years versus 6 to 8 years. Of course, those fires may be more intensive depending on burn conditions, but of course you have a lot more fuel. Uh, the vertical structure, the structure of vegetation typically is taller. And when I talk about vegetation structure, and I'm going to mention this lots of times throughout, I'm talking about both the density and the height of the vegetation, which is a primary driver of wildlife species occupancy in different stands or fields as well. It doesn't matter whether it's a wooded area or non-wooded area. The third one, and I've inserted available sunlight here actually above frequency. I think we all realize this, but for some reason, available sunlight is very rarely talked about. And we began measuring the amount of sunlight coming into to an area several years ago using devices that measure the percent of photosynthetic active radiation. And so we use these septometers that electronically record the photons coming in and how much sunlight is entering an area. It's a very precise way of capturing the amount of sunlight coming in. And of course, the sunlight, or alternatively, the shade, strongly affects species composition, the height of the plants, density of the vegetation. As you can see on the upper right there, in a developing oak savanna where we have 95+% sunlight coming in, the oak woodland on bottom right that has 50% sunlight coming in, or the mature oak hickory forest on the bottom left, where fire has been used, but low intensity, very infrequent, but essentially removed the mid-story. And without the mid-story, even with a closed canopy, we're getting somewhere around 15% sunlight. And I'll show you more of that in just a couple of minutes. And then the fourth one, of course, is season. And there's a lot of work going on now looking at the fire effects using fire during different seasons of the year. And it's one of the things I'm really strongly interested in. We've been doing this for a while. It's been very exciting to see some of the results that have come about. Of course, dormant season fire typically consumes the litter layer, stimulates woody sprouting, whereas growing season fire may reduce woody composition more than dormant season fire, but you might also see a differential effect in composition of plants, especially in the understory, when using fire at different periods of the growing season. So let's start with intensity. Here's a picture of another stand that has been burned very hot. This time, they were unable to get in and do mechanical removal in an effort to increase forest openings. And so instead, they used high intensity fire and were very successful. Completely changed the structure of the site, flipped the composition by at least 50%. Of course, many of the tree species that were standing as canopy trees now are resprouting or growing down low, but still we've had a huge turnover in species composition. Now, immediately after such a fire, you're going to have essentially 100% sunlight coming in. But because of these resprouting trees, especially after about the second growing season, with the amount of leaf material on the trees during the summertime, that amount of sunlight is going to drop drastically. And so right now, and especially by the third growing season after such fire, you're probably on most sites going to have considerably less than 50% sunlight coming in. And of course, the structure of such a site, as you see, is very good and requisite for many species that require that structure, both for nesting or foraging, as you see here. Alternatively, when using really low intensity fire in a closed canopy situation, as you see here, a closed canopy stand will typically have 2 to 5% sunlight coming in, and most often it will be between 2 and 3%. If you use low intensity fire, as I'm showing here, and especially over a few fires with a relatively short fire return interval, you typically reduce the mid-story such that you open the stand up and you get a little more sunlight coming in. And on average, what you see without any canopy removal, just with the mid-story removal, you're increasing the amount of sunlight to about 15%. And this is quite consistent. Now, that does increase understory vegetation a fair amount, but it is extremely limited as compared to more sunlight coming in, which I will show you, and it also strongly influences the composition of the plants. In this situation, more of the plants are going to be more shade tolerant and also woody plants, as opposed to those that would be found more in stands where you open it up and allow more sunlight to come in. So let's go from a closed canopy situation and using some data from relatively old work to kind of catch up. We're going from a closed canopy situation with very little sunlight. And if you see there, I've got the amount of deer forage that is available in such a stand, terrible cover for fawns, for nesting or brooding, wild turkeys, etc. And within just a couple of years and even one or two fires that uh, is consuming the leaf litter and stimulating the vegetation. And with a little canopy removal through either thinning or simply killing the trees, we get a drastic effect where we have 6 to 7 times as much forage available for deer, and we have drastically changed the amount of nesting and brooding cover for turkeys. And so this is where we started many years ago in the early 2000s, looking at the effect of growing season fire. And at that time, we were concentrating on using fire early in the spring, as they used to say, just about the time the leaves bud out and are about the size of a mouse's ear. And you were supposed to be able to change the world if you're burning at that time of year versus just a couple of weeks prior. That is not entirely true. There is some difference as I'm going to go through here with you, but what we've done is dig into this much deeper and found a lot of nuance and a lot of difference between burning at that time versus later in the year. So let's go forward. Now we're in a stand that's providing about 33% sunlight, and we're burning during the latter portion of the growing season using low intensity fire. Now, what we found is over several iterations of fire on several sites, and this is real world data over, as I mentioned, several sites and fires, not just one. But on average, we're getting considerably less uh, temperature that we measure from hobo loggers when using late growing season fire as opposed to early growing season fire. And that is a direct result of the amount of moisture and the conditions that are in the stand at that time. Now, what I'm going to show you is this difference in fire intensity has an interaction with season that is causing a difference both in the structure of the plants as well as the composition of the plants. And so we measure structure with what we call a NUDS board, where we get measurements of how much visual obstruction there is in different strata that you can see there on the left side, going from ground level at the bottom up to 6.5 feet up at the top. And the amount of those blocks that are shaded in, either by orange or gray, represents the amount of vertical obstruction going up on a vertical plane and directly relates to the amount of visibility in the stand, which is a strong driver of occupancy and use by different wildlife species. So here's a picture of a technician holding a NUDS board, and there we're collecting measurements of visual obstruction following the treatments.
I wonder who it is.
So here's a picture showing the control on the left side, the results in the growing season immediately following fire of both of these, early growing season in the middle and late growing season on the right. And you can see the difference in structure. And the difference in structure is important for several species. For example, brooding turkeys certainly like more of an open structure with shorter vegetation than taller vegetation that impedes their visibility. Whereas for nesting or cover for fawning, more vertical obstruction with taller cover is important, and you see preferential use of those areas. And in fact, when we combine this with work that we've done in the Turkey Research Project, where we followed more than 650 nests over 8 years' time in South Middle Tennessee, we found that hens were more than 2 times likely to choose a site for nesting with every 10% increase in visual obstruction up to 2 feet above ground. And also, cover above the nest increased daily nest survival by about 2% per day as you went from zero cover above the nest to 100% cover above the nest. So all of a sudden, wow, we're seeing where we could change the timing of our burning to positively influence site selection for nesting or brooding as well as survival. So that's a big deal. We also see that the intensity influences the composition. Where we have less intensity, we're seeing more of the tree saplings or seedlings or brambles escape the fire, and as you can see right here. And then we also see an effect of sunlight where the control areas that are receiving much less sunlight have far less forb grass, bramble, and scrub cover than the treatment areas. Um, I'm picking up some sound of somebody talking. I think it might be on Sean's site there. There you go. Thanks, Sean. So if we look at these areas with regard to turkey use, we see that turkey use following the timing of fire is greatest in the early growing season units as opposed to the late growing season units throughout the brooding season because of this more open structure. So if I go to another project where we're using 9 sites in 4 states, looking at timing of fire where we have increased the number of treatments, we have control as well as our treatments of late growing season, that's LGS, dormant season, which is DOS, early growing season, EGS, and mid growing season, MGS. Our late growing season treatments are in September, October, maybe into early November. Dormant season is January through March, and early growing season is April, May, and mid growing season is June and July. And so here you can see the difference in temperature, and this is across 81 fires that we've conducted so far in this study, where we're getting, of course, the highest temperature in the dormant season fire. Late growing season and early growing season fire temperatures are the same in this study as it has come out. And then the temperature in the mid growing season fire is the least. So if we take a look at one of our sites, and this one is in Tennessee in a shortleaf stand, and this is a picture of one of the dormant season burns where we're trying to have a little more intensity because the shortleaf can stand that, whereas hardwoods would not. And we're trying to set back some hardwood encroachment. You see the difference in intensity here in the dormant season versus the mid-growing season, and this is in a July fire. Now, on this site right here, we got a little better than 80% coverage of the burn, but you can see the intensity is drastically less than in the picture that I just showed you. And so in the real world, if you're trying to burn at certain times of the year, there's a lot of times when you can burn that the temperatures are not that the conditions are not exactly the way you want, and so you're going to have variability. And we're all aware of that. But here is a real world example of where conditions were good on this day in July, but we didn't get the intensity that was needed to, of course, top kill many of these stems. And I'm very interested in knowing what the effect of top kill and control of these stems are through the year. And so what we've done, as you see right there, we have placed tags, metal tags in these trees, both seedlings and saplings of different species and different sizes. And so we are monitoring them individually to see what percentage are top killed, what the fire temperature is when they're top killed or not, and then what is the resprouting rate of those that were top killed. Now, these data right here are very preliminary. Of course, we haven't published this yet. We've only been collecting these tree tag data for a couple of years, and I think we have 880 tree tags out, and we're going to be continuing this over more years' time. But already this is looking very interesting. Of the small trees that were top killed in the late growing season fire treatment, of those that were top killed, about 75% of those resprout. Of the ones that are top killed from early or mid growing season fire, a little more than 90% of those resprout. And the dormant season treatment of those that are top killed, 97% of them resprout. So, wow, if this continues and we're able to see a 20 some percentage point difference in total mortality following top kill from a late growing season fire versus mid, early, or dormant, that will really help us with regard to our to meeting objectives if we're wanting to transition from a strong woody stem community to more herbaceous cover. Now, alternatively, and how most of these data are collected, and of course we have this in all of our vegetation transects, is plant coverage. And so if we look at percent woody plant coverage, and that's of shrubs and trees that are in the understory, we see that both early and late growing season fire do the best at reducing coverage of these woody plants. And this is a statistical and a biological difference separating those from control, dormant, and mid-growing. Of course, as I just showed, nearly all of the stems that are top killed during dormant resprout, and more of them resprout in that mid-growing season because we're not getting as much heat and coverage to have reduced coverage of those plants in that treatment. However, I suspected that these data were not, although accurate, it's not precise because if you're measuring coverage, you might have one resprouting tree or shrub that has greater coverage on a transect or in a frame or what have you as another that doesn't have as much leaf area. And so it's much more precise to follow those stems individually with those metal tags. They're both showing close to the same thing, but I believe the metal tag data is going to be much more precise and more accurate with regard to what's actually going on following these fire treatments. When we look at the percent forb coverage, we see the greatest forb response following the dormant and the late growing season fires. I don't think this is surprising. I think we should figure this to happen because when you think about the biology of these plants, most of these are warm season plants. And so when we set them back during the period of their growth, we can expect them to be set back or even decline. Whereas if we're burning after they have flowered and produced seed, we then are removing a litter layer that allows more of them to germinate and come out. And so we're seeing more expression, more coverage of forbs, most of these being warm season forbs, following dormant and late growing season than the other times. However, although in that year after burning during the dormant season, we see more forbs, all of the woody stems are resprouting. They then are out competing the forbs that are resprouting. And so overall and over time, we expect to see and we have seen a greater proportion of forb cover following the late growing season fire than dormant because of the competition, the increased competition in the dormant season treatments. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't conduct any prescribed fire in the summertime or at any other time of year, just that there are differences. So I find this very interesting when we look at the effects of burning during the mid-growing season. Here we are. If you look at this is showing the number of feeding photos by deer, and I'm gonna have emphasis on deer and turkeys in here. Number one, that's what I work with more than anything else, but also that's two species that more landowners are interested in who manage their land than all the other species combined. And so I like to use management of these two generalist species to implement more habitat management and create more habitat for more non-game species that also need a variety, a diversity of vegetation types and successional stages in order to find them on a property. So we published papers on this, how managing specifically for deer directly is benefiting a grand suite of these non-game species that are getting very little management attention. So I'm not apologizing for working with deer. I'm somewhat of, well, I'm into managing for deer. I like to see things grow and later shoot them, and I think many of you do too. And so it's a lot of fun in this. But nonetheless, if we look at the feeding photos here on the bottom left, with spring green up comes increased feeding photos. That shouldn't be a surprise. And so if you look at the gray line, that's with no fire. Those feeding photos go down as time goes on because the plants are growing larger and they're less digestible. You see, the orange line follows the same pattern. There has been no fire yet. The blue fire follows the same pattern, except because burning occurred in March, and you top killed those stems, you get resprouting and you get fresh germination from the seed bank. And so the foraging time is extended. And so you can see how that foraging time in the March fire is wider and larger than that with no fire. Now, the orange line follows the gray line all the way until June when we burn. And then all of a sudden, the feeding photos pick back up because you have all of that fresh, nutritious, resprouting vegetation. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at that histogram graph up in the right corner there, cumulatively, we see that there are more feeding photos following the June fire treatment than with the March fire treatment, which is very interesting. And obviously, you are extending the high quality foraging window over a longer portion of the growing season than with the dormant season fire. So, if we look at the nutrition, the nutritional value of plants following burning at different times of the year, we see in dark gray there in control that it is less than the both crude protein and phosphorus of the gray bar following the March burn, because you have fresh resprouting vegetation. It's not that fire has pushed more protein or phosphorus into the plant. It's simply a relic of those plants are resprouting, growing fresh. There's more young plant material, which is more digestible, has more digestible nutrients than older plant material. And I'll show you here in the next slide or two exactly why that is. But first, look at the July grass, and you see following June burning that the crude protein and the phosphorus values are even greater in July than the vegetation from control or the March fire in July. So obviously we are extending the amount of high quality vegetation through the growing season, which is critical for deer during the antler growing season and during the season of lactation for the females. So if we go back to the 7-site study that or 9-site study that I talked to you about, 9 sites in Tennessee, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. If we look at deer use of the treatments in May and July, during the period that is of greatest nutritional demand for deer, and we look at EGS, that's the early growing season, in 2021 and 2023 is when we implemented the fires. And so that's when you see the elevated use during May through July is in that growing season immediately after fire. And so obviously the deer are coming into those units more at that time. If we go to August, September, which is one of the periods of greatest nutritional stress, especially in the South where we really don't have a winter stressful period, nutritional quality during late summer going into early fall before the mass drops is a period of high nutritional stress. And so if we look at this, and the August-September timeframe, and we look at those MGS graphs, the MGS was burned in 2022 and excuse me, 2023, and see how you have elevated use of those treatments in August, September following that June, July fire. And so if any of you are familiar with patch burn grazing. It's where they have, a large pasture with paddocks that are burned through different periods, and the cattle flock to those paddocks that were most recently burned because of the most nutritious forage. We are essentially doing this on properties where we are burning areas across the property and kind of moving deer around, and of course keeping it within their annual home range size. You can move those deer around such that they have the most nutritious forage available to them throughout the growing seasons. And so this is causing huge positive benefits in the nutritional carrying capacity and also in the physical condition of the individual deer. Here we see some black gum sprouts coming up. And if we look at the mineral and nutrient content from these sprout leaves, this is pretty cool. The stump sprout has greater crude protein and greater phosphorus than the limb leaves of shrubs or trees that have not been cut or not been burned and not resprouting. And obviously, it compares to the crude protein in forb and actually exceeds the phosphorus level in forbs, which is noteworthy because the forbs are the king of nutrition for white-tailed deer. And here is the reason. We got phosphorus on the y-axis and DBH on the x-axis. It's got to do with the root to shoot ratio. You've got a tree with an existing root system that was supporting the whole tree. Now the top portion of the tree has been removed, and those roots are still pushing those nutrients into the sprouts. There's far less biomass of sprouts than there was of the whole tree previously before it being cut or burned. And so you have elevated mineral content in the leaves of those sprouts. And you can see the effect right there as the DBH of the tree or shrub gets larger, deer use increases. The phosphorus content increases as well as you see here, the deer use. So I think this is pretty neat. By cutting some of these trees or burning some of these trees and having increased sprouting, we elevate the nutritional availability to deer, and we can see them flocking to these areas, such as you see this with the resprouting elm, and even with brambles such as this blackberry that now is resprouting and regrowing in August following a July burn. And so we simply are keeping fresh, more highly digestible and more nutritious vegetation available to deer longer. And providing this variable structure and this pulse of increased nutrition over time and space on a property is very important, not only to white-tailed deer, such as the lactating doe, but also for the turkey poults. And what we found through the turkey project is with every 10% increase in forb cover, hens with broods are almost 4 times more likely to use them. This is powerful management information that we can use to our advantage. Now, when we switch to frequency, we know that influences structure in a big way if the intensity is enough to top kill the stems. Now, you can burn with extremely low intensity fire, and if you don't top kill the stems, then you're not going to see the effect. So there's that interaction between frequency and intensity. And here's the structure that we typically see with a 1 to 2 year fire return interval that's maintaining a nice herbaceous understory, optimal deer forage, and also the habitat structure that many other species are searching for. If we wait and burn on a 4 year fire return interval, this is typically the structure that we're promoting and maintaining. Still, there's other species that will be using and requiring this type of structure. And also, I want to mention here how the seasonal effects with regard to promoting more forbs or reducing the woody composition, more grasses, etc., that may be negated if your fire return interval is 3 years or longer, because then the woody plants are the ones that are really guiding the direction of this community, not as much the season of your burning. Your and I'll show you some more results here in just a second, but the effects of your season of burning are going to be greatest if you're burning every 1 to 2 years as opposed to longer than that. And if you're waiting even longer, such as this, on an 8-year fire return interval, and here we implemented a shelterwood with reserves where we're waiting different numbers of years until we come in and uh, re-enter with fire. We see how the trees obviously have completely shaded out any herbaceous cover underneath, but yet that structure still is strongly preferred by different wildlife species, of which are of great interest to landowners in Pennsylvania. And one of the last areas I want to take you to is the prescribed fire demonstration area just west of Crossville, Tennessee, on the Cumberland Plateau. I showed you some results of this several years ago, but I wanted to revisit this because we continue to implement treatments and continue to collect data, and it's been just really neat to see. But as you see, a map of the area is on the right side. We've got 6 units in which we burn either in April or in September, October. So we have early growing season fire and late growing season fire treatments. Of those, we have 1 unit that is burned every year, a unit that is burned every 2 years, and a unit that is burned every 3 years. So we have both a frequency and seasonal treatment interaction here. And at the bottom, we have a unit that we call the woodland. And in the woodland, we simply burn it at random, and every time we burn it, we'll pull a number out of the hat, one, two, or three, and a letter, either E or L, to determine whether we're going to burn in 1, 2, or 3 years, or whether we're going to burn during the early growing season or late growing season. So it's just a random treatment that we implement there. This is a demonstration area. It's not replicated anywhere, but if you don't have a good demonstration area for prescribed fire to take not only students and professionals for in-service training, but also to allow the public to see, this is gold. And we have signage up all around the area, a trail that you can go in and look at everything. This is a strong educational tool. So anyway, if I'm standing on the fire break where that X is right now, and I'm looking to the east, to the right, this is what I see. I'm standing on the fire break right here. You see the late growing season 2 year return interval on the left, and the early growing season 2 year interval on the right. And so if I turn to the right, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is going to save me a few slides just by showing the pictures. You see this in the early growing season 2 year fire return interval. You can see that we burn it every 2 years from 2012 to 2014, and how that is strongly promoting the C4 grasses. In this case, it's little blue stem, split beard blue stem, broom sedge blue stem, a little bit of uh, big blue stem and bushy blue stem, but especially little broom sedge and split. A few forbs coming in, a few woodies, hanging on, and a fair amount of post oak and white oak in this area, shortleaf pine in this area, and those are hanging on. If I turn around, this is what I see. You see considerably less C4 grass. You see considerably more forbs, and as you search through there, you may see a few more woodies because of the in general lower intensity in the late growing season versus the early growing season. But nonetheless, a very real visual difference. And here, if we look at some of the data we collected, if you look at that top middle histogram bar graph, EGS2, early growing season 2 year interval, that's percent cover of C4 grasses on the y-axis, and you see how that has been climbing, climbing, climbing. And if you compare that to the orange ones down on the bottom, you see they are far less prevalent in the late growing season. And I'll quickly mention this used to be a loblolly plantation until the timber company sold it to the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency in 1997 when it was liquidated. From that time on, nothing happened. Only the seed bank germinated. Nothing has ever been planted here whatsoever. The only thing that has been done, no disking, no herbicide applications. The only thing that's been done is fire. And we started the prescribed fire demonstration area in 2011 to look at the difference in timing of fire and fire frequency. If we look at the annual late growing season treatment, you see just flush with forbs. And I'm not giving a presentation on this, but there are few wildlife species that need any more than about 38 or about 30% grass, and having a stronger forb component is very important. And Kip has already texted me saying I'm going longer, but I had to start a little late. I got like two more graphs, slides, Kip, and we're good. But look at this, where the ground cover represented by forbs. If you're at an annual fire return interval, we're maintaining or increasing that forb cover. But if we go down to 2 or especially 3 years, the amount of forb cover is going down. Now that's with 95% sunlight. If we look at the frequency effect, on the left is the early growing season treatment 2 year, on the right, early growing season 3 year. Look at the difference. I mean, it is turning into a woody thicket, and we're setting it back every 3 years. So having going from 2 to 3 years is a big deal. And here you can see how waiting 3 years is strongly increasing the tree coverage, resprouting trees, whereas at 1 year it's being held at bay. And there's some variation there. Even with 2 years, it's increasing a little, but we're able to set that back pretty easily. Last one is a success story in Tennessee. This is at the Foothills WMA, which is one of our study sites. And some of you have properties, especially on public lands or large private lands, where you're trying to do this. We're promoting more of an oak pine woodland, and they reduced the closed canopy forest on 800 of 6,800 acres from 2017 to 20. Immediately, we had a strong response of woodland obligate species and in large abundance. And at the same time, we saw the turkey, deer, and bear harvest go up exponentially when we compared the 3 years prior to management to the last 3 years of management. So, in conclusion, every day should be considered a potential burn day. Frequent fire is necessary to promote these woodlands. Fire timing through the year does produce different results. Intensity, frequency, sunlight, and timing are all interacting, but sunlight is a major factor in the response. Late growing season fire tends to produce more forb coverage over time, and early growing season fire, if it's on a short fire return interval, tends to produce more C4 grasses over time. Growing season fire does set back woody species better than dormant, but we're seeing later in the growing season might even be better. Select your sites for management carefully. And lastly, consider your scale of management. And especially for the private landowners that are in the group, I want you to look at this. This is an 8-acre woodland that has been burned twice, only twice, on a 2 year fire return interval with 60% sunlight. Imagine the food and cover availability if you're burning different areas. And it doesn't have to, I'm not, 8 acres is not magic, but 5 to 25 acres. And consider that, a mature whitetail doe or a mature whitetail buck's 50% core area in the summertime is only, on average, 35 acres. And you're wanting to maximize the cover and food availability on your property. There is nothing that you can do that will have a stronger effect than this right here. I believe that uh, wholeheartedly. And so, if we have time, Kip, I'm happy to try and answer any questions the audience might have.